Hello class. This week we're looking at class and stratification. Stratification attempts to explain institutionalized patterns of social inequality. In other words, it simply explains who gets what, how, and why in looking at power, wealth, and prestige. In looking at the class structure according to Marx, Marx argues that capitalism divides society into owners to the means of production versus those whose survival depends upon selling their labor to those with the means of production. Marx argues that the capitalists exploit workers in order to make profits or in order to survive. Do they provide opportunities for people to come out of poverty? Not so much, because it's all about them, that is, the capitalists. When we take a look at functional integration argues that inequality is essential to society. In other words, society needs the medical doctor just as much as it needs the janitor. It needs the brain scientist just as much as it needs the person who works at McDonald's. Now, we have Thorstein Veblen, and Thorstein Veblen, his theory is called the theory of conspicuous consumption. Under this theory, Veblen argues that those who do the most undesirable work, that is, work that no one wants, should receive the highest pay. He also argues that people spend not because of a need, but they spend to demonstrate wealth. So in other words, I buy a Lamborghini not because I need a car, because of course I could buy a Toyota Corolla, which costs $30,000, but I choose a Lamborghini costing $500,000 because I want people to know that I have money. So in other words, I am spending for a show. Now, Max Weber, on the other hand, argues that when you take a look at power, power is not necessarily about economics. Rather, he says power is simply a dimension of stratification, and that there are other sources of power aside from money. For example, if one is a government official, one may not necessarily have money, but they have power. In other words, the office gives them power. Now, there's some cultures that money doesn't equate to power as much as there are other things in those cultures that determine what makes one powerful. For example, for some Asian cultures, power lies in age. So the older you are, or the elderly in other words, is perceived to have much power. Now, when we take a look at class structure, here in the United States, we have different class structures. We have the upper class, the corporate class, the middle class, the working class, and the lower class. The upper class is property owners. The corporate class is a class that involves, is run by large bureaucratic organizations. The middle class owns some property. The working class own little to no property. And the lower class generally own no property, or they're unemployed or poor. Now, I want us to launch off at this time in looking at two books that bring to fore the economics of the United States. One of the books is entitled Politics of the Rich and the Poor by Kevin Phillips. Now, I know this is a relatively old book. Nonetheless, as it was written in 1990, nonetheless, there are elements of this book that existed back then, and some of those same elements we're dealing with today. For example, according to Kevin Phillips of the Politics of the Rich and the Poor, the 1980s was the first time in U.S. history that the United States became a national debtor, meaning that we owed a lot of people money. The United States borrowed lots of money in the 1980s. In the 1980s, luxury purchases flourished, unemployment was lowered, and inflation was down. By the time Reagan ended his second term, the top half of 1% of the U.S. population became richer, while income stagnated for for the poor. Household incomes were buying less. Federal income taxes dropped for the wealthy. Now, the problem with this is that this was a period that could not be linked to any wars. So normally when society gets that stressed in that people become really, really poor, there's normally some war, there's normally some issues of war going on. But this was peacetime. The United States was not at war. So then, why were we so poor during this time? We were so poor because we were doing things such as funding tax cuts for the wealthy. We were busy with a defense buildup, even though there's no war. And we were trying to avert inflation. As we did that, we saw that other countries were also experiencing poverty issues, but how the U.S. addressed the poverty issue was different to other countries. For example, France, they imposed the wealth tax, which, by the way, if you listen to the election rhetoric, we have people like Warren that's proposing a wealth tax. But hey, look, this is something that way back in the 1980s, France already did, right? So Britain and Japan reduced income taxes for the poor and increased it for the wealth. Now that is Bernie's argument, right? That he wants to increase income taxes for the wealthy and decrease it for the poor. So back in the 1980s, how did Reagan propose to solve this economic crisis? He argues that people are poor because they want to be poor. As a matter of fact, he says people want to be on welfare because it's a generational thing. But trust me, no one wants to be on welfare if you don't have to be. And if there are people who want to be on welfare, it's not a lot. It's just a handful, right? He argues that with the trickle-down economy, if we empower large businesses, give them tax incentives, give them rebates, give them lots and lots of tax breaks, then they will come into poor neighborhoods, establish businesses, and so the money will trickle down. The reality is, when you take a look at that, who benefits the most? The rich. And the least, again, the poor, right? As we were going through economic turmoil in the 1980s, what was happening? We had where cheap imports were capturing the U.S. market. The devaluation of the U.S. dollar became very evident when compared to the euro or when compared to the British pound. We had East Asians and Europeans taking the United States as a bargain basement where they could get cheap stuff. And of course they could get cheap stuff here because their money was worth more here. Americans became second-class citizens in our own country. For example, most of the properties in Hawaii, one of our most prized real estate, were owned by the Japanese. We had U.S. colleges that were now bought over by Japanese. For example, Loretta Heights in Colorado and Warner Pacific in Oregon. We had West Germany now ahead in exports. Now, exports become important, an important marker for the economics of a country, because we have to realize that in order for a country to export, it has to have done well within its own borders. So now it has had sufficient that now it can export. The Japanese owned 17 of 25 of the world's largest and richest companies. And right now it may not seem significant to you, but when we take a look at race and ethnicity, you will see how that number and that country becomes significant on a global spectrum. We take a look at patents. 47% of U.S. patents were owned by foreigners. The deregulation of the airline industry sent many U.S. airlines out of business. For example, Pan Am, Eastern Airlines, Transworld Airlines. And so we saw the economic issues of the 1980s. We're now seeing a resurgence of those same issues. So again, the book Kevin Phillips is introduced right now to show us that there's little reinvention of the wheel. What we're experiencing now in terms of politics and economics is virtually the same thing that we experienced back in the 1980s. Now, Saul Levitan introduces us to programs in aid of the poor. Levitan starts off by telling us who is poor. And he argues that the poor is those who have lack of goods or services needed for adequate standard of living. Then he comes on and he tells us who are poor. He said the aged, children, the unemployed, the working poor. Why are these people poor? The aged is poor because the reality is that they spend a lot of money on meds and medical care. Children are poor because they're not in a position that they can either earn their own money or spend their own money. The unemployed is poor because they're unemployed. And you have the working poor. The working poor is that mom or dad working 60, 70 hours a week and still not able to meet basic bills, still not able to meet the rent, or the mortgage, still not able to cover the family's finances, even though they're working X amount of hours. God forbid they get sick and have to pull out of the workforce, then their entire lives fall apart. Now, according to Levitan, there are several programs that are available to the poor, and these programs range from cash benefits, which includes aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC. It includes Social Security benefits. It includes veterans benefits and unemployment insurance. AFDC grew after World War II, which was between 1947 to 1972. We saw a growth in AFDC. But by the Reagan years, 50% of those eligible to get AFDC were removed from its roles because Reagan made it so strict to get it, because of course he didn't believe in it, that people who once qualified no longer qualify. Right now, as we experience economic changes within our current administration, we had a few states who are suing the Trump administration because they have done the exact same thing with food stamps. So the argument is that there are people out there, able-bodied people that can work, and so they need to go on food stamps. So they're retracting both benefits and they're making it stricter to get food stamps. States are saying, hey, look, these people that are on food stamps really have no other option. And so if you pull this blanket from under them, it's going to be disastrous for us. So again, same thing happening during the Reagan era as is happening today. Then we have Social Security, and in order to get Social Security benefits, you have to either be a U.S. citizen, or in some cases for Social Security retirement, you have to be elderly, or for Social Security disability, you have to be disabled. Then we have veterans benefits that you can only get if you're a veteran. Unemployment insurance you can only get if you've worked for a certain period of time. Um, if you've only worked for a certain period of time. We have direct provision, for example, medical care, food stamps, and shelter. Under medical care, we have Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is for the elderly or for the long-term ill, while Medicaid is for the poor. We have food benefits such as food stamps, Meals on Wheels, school feeding programs, and we have WIC for women, infants, and children, pregnant women, or children under 5 years old. We also have Medicaid. Medicaid is we have Medicaid. Medicaid is for the poor, and Medicare is for the rich. Now, we have support services for the poor. Support services such as WIN, or Work Incentive Programs. This is where someone can receive government benefits, but it's attached to a work requirement. We have employment-related programs where someone will be trained or retrained to join the workforce. And we have redevelopment of urban areas. We have the Job Corps to help people to gain employment. Having said that, just wrapping up the lecture, in class on stratification, we started off by looking at the different perspectives by which society relates or needs the concept of class and stratification. And we ended up by looking at Kevin Phillips and how he dissected the 1980s, to Sar Leviton, who told us about programs that are available for the poor. Thank you. Bye-bye.